May 8, 1945. 11:47 a.m. Flensburg, northern Germany. The convoy stopped where the road turned to gravel. Diesel fumes hung in the spring air, thick and acrid, mixing with the smell of wet wool and fear. 32 women sat in the back of British transport trucks, hands still bound with wire that had cut into wrists for 3 days. They had not spoken since the border crossing. They had learned that silence was safer than questions, that stillness could sometimes pass for invisibility. The engines cut. Boots hit gravel. One woman closed her eyes. Another began to pray in a whisper so quiet it sounded like breathing. They braced for shouting, for orders barked in anger, for the violence that follows defeat. The first word they heard was please. The canvas flap pulled back. Daylight flooded in, sharp and unforgiving, and the women flinched as if struck. A British sergeant stood at the tailgate, his uniform dusty but pressed, his face unreadable. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of weariness that comes not from a single battle but from years of them. He did not shout. He did not reach for his sidearm. He looked at the row of faces, grey with exhaustion, streaked with dirt, eyes hollow and watchful, and he spoke in careful, accented German. Please, he said again. Step down slowly. No one will harm you. No one moved. The wire around their wrists had been tied by retreating Wehrmacht officers 3 days earlier, men who knew the war was ending and wanted to deliver prisoners as proof of loyalty, as currency, as something, anything, to trade for mercy. The women were auxiliary personnel, signals operators, nurses, clerks, kitchen staff. They had been stationed in Denmark when the collapse came, had been ordered south in chaos, had been handed over to British forces near the Elbe with nothing but the clothes they wore and terror in their chests. They had expected execution. They had expected work camps. They had expected the stories told in whispers at night, stories of what happened to women when armies changed hands. The sergeant stepped back. He gestured to a younger soldier, a corporal with red hair and freckles who looked barely old enough to shave. The corporal approached with wire cutters. He knelt in the truck bed. His hands were steady. One by one, he cut the bindings. One by one, the women stared at their freed wrists as if they belonged to someone else. And then the sergeant asked the question. When did you last eat? The woman closest to him, 23 years old, a signals operator named Greta, though he would not learn her name until later, opened her mouth to answer. No sound came. She tried again. Her lips formed the words but her throat closed, and suddenly she was weeping, shoulders shaking, gasping for air she couldn't seem to catch. The sergeant did not move closer. He did not reach out. He simply waited, hands at his sides, until the sobbing quieted into ragged breaths. 3 days, she finally whispered. He nodded once. Come, he said. There is tea. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. The women who stumbled off those trucks in May 1945 had been swept into the machinery of total war the way millions were, not by ideology, not by choice, but by circumstance and the accident of birth. Germany had mobilized its female population in ways Britain and the United States never fully matched, pulling women into roles that ranged from clerical to combat adjacent. By 1943, nearly 500,000 women served in auxiliary units, the Luftwaffe's Flakhelferinnen, the Wehrmacht's Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the SS Administrative Corps. They operated radios, decoded signals, tracked supplies, nursed the wounded. They wore uniforms. They took orders. They were, by any practical definition, soldiers. When the collapse came, when the Eastern and Western fronts crumbled in a matter of weeks, these women became ghosts. Some fled west toward British and American lines. Some were captured by Soviet forces and disappeared into the Gulag system, never to return. Some were abandoned by their own commanders, left to navigate occupied territory with nothing but their wits and the hope that mercy existed somewhere in the wreckage. The 32 women in the convoy had been stationed in Copenhagen, attached to a signals unit that coordinated naval communications across the Baltic. When Denmark fell silent in the first week of May, their commanding officer, a captain in his 50s who had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front, gathered them in a supply depot and spoke with the kind of exhausted honesty that only comes when pretense no longer serves a purpose. The war is over, he said. The British are 12 kilometers west. The Soviets are 60 kilometers east. You have a choice. Half the unit went east, believing the propaganda about Slavic barbarity to be exaggeration. The other half, including Greta, went west. The captain stayed behind. He was found 3 days later, dead by his own hand, a pistol in one hand and a photograph of his sons in the other. The truck convoy rolled south through the remains of the Reich. The roads were clogged with refugees, with surrendered soldiers, with the hollow-eyed displaced persons who spoke a dozen languages and trusted no one. The women sat in silence, watching the landscape of defeat scroll past, burnt-out tanks, farmhouses with white sheets hanging from windows, children standing in ditches with their hands out for food. No one had food to give. By the second day, the women's rations, a single loaf of black bread shared among 32, were gone. By the third day, thirst was worse than hunger. One woman fainted. Another vomited bile. Greta watched the British soldiers in the cab of the truck, waiting for the moment when decency would crack, when the reality of what they were, German, defeated, female, would override whatever orders kept them safe. The moment never came. At the border crossing, a British officer inspected their papers, military identity cards that meant nothing now, that might as well have been blank. He asked questions in clipped English that the women barely understood. He wrote notes on a clipboard. Then he handed the papers back, gestured them through, and that was all. No interrogation. No summary judgment. Just bureaucracy, mundane and almost surreal in its orderliness. They arrived at a processing camp outside Flensburg just before noon. The camp had been a Wehrmacht barracks 2 weeks earlier. Now it was a holding facility, one of dozens scattered across the British zone, designed to sort the surrendered masses into categories: combatants, civilians, SS, refugees, displaced persons. The women were directed to a corrugated metal building at the camp's edge, its windows covered with blackout cloth left over from the war. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and sweat. Rows of cots lined the walls. A wood stove radiated heat in the corner. The sergeant who had cut their bindings appeared in the doorway. Behind him, 2 soldiers carried a steaming metal urn. Another brought a crate of tin cups. The sergeant gestured to the stove. "Sit," he said. "Drink first. Then we talk." Tea. Not the acrid ersatz brewed from bark and chicory that had been their ration for 2 years. Real tea, dark and bitter and scalding hot, poured into cups that burned their fingers. The women held those cups as if they were sacraments. Some drank slowly, savoring each sip. Others gulped until they choked, unable to stop. Greta held hers with both hands, staring into the steam, and for the first time in 3 days, she let herself believe she might survive. The sergeant watched from the doorway. He did not speak. He did not rush them. He simply stood, arms crossed, his face shadowed by the angle of the light, and waited until every cup was empty. Then he nodded to the corporal, who brought bread, thick slices of white bread, the kind no one in Germany had seen since 1942, and margarine in waxed paper, and jam in small glass jars labeled with Red Cross insignias. The women ate in silence, chewing slowly, tasting salt in their tears. One of them, a nurse named Ilse, 31, who had worked in a field hospital in Normandy, set her bread down halfway through and looked up at the sergeant. Her voice was hoarse. "Why?" He did not pretend to misunderstand. "Because you are prisoners," he said. "Not animals." It was the simplest answer. It was also the only one that mattered. "I thought kindness had died with the war," Greta would later write in a diary she began that summer, filling its pages with careful script in a barracks where electric lights burned past curfew. "I thought decency was another casualty, buried somewhere between Stalingrad and Berlin. I was wrong. It was waiting, patient and quiet, on the other side of surrender." The British handled their prisoners of war with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic. It was not sentimentality. It was not forgiveness. It was something older and more deliberate, a commitment to the idea that civilization survived not in victory but in restraint. The policy had been codified in the Geneva Conventions, yes, but it ran deeper than treaties. It was a mirror held up to the self, a way of asking, who are we when no one is watching? What do we become when mercy costs us nothing and cruelty would be easy? In September 1944, a memo circulated through the War Office in London, stamped and filed and distributed to camp commandants across Britain and the occupied zones. Its language was bureaucratic, almost mundane, but its implications were profound. Prisoners of war are soldiers, not criminals. They will be housed, fed, and treated in accordance with international law. Retaliation is forbidden. Dignity is non-negotiable. Those 34 words shaped the architecture of captivity for 3 million German prisoners held by British forces between 1944 and 1948. They were words tested daily in camps where guards had lost brothers to German shells, where commandants had seen photographs of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, Where mercy required more than policy, it required will. 3 principles anchored the system. Security: prisoners would be contained, counted, and controlled, not out of malice but necessity. Diplomacy: humane treatment ensured reciprocity, protecting British POWs held in German camps until the war's end. Morality: restraint was the price of calling oneself civilized. They were not always honored. There were failures, abuses, lapses. But the standard held more often than it broke. And for the women in Flensburg, that standard was the difference between survival and erasure. The first week was disorientation. The women were deloused, examined by medics, issued British Army blankets and second-hand clothing from relief supplies. They slept 12 to a room in what had been officers' quarters, their cots arranged with military precision. Breakfast arrived at 0700, porridge, bread, tea. Lunch at 1300, soup, potatoes, sometimes tinned meat. Dinner at 1800, more bread, cheese, weak coffee. The portions were small, Britain itself was still rationed, but they were consistent. For women who had lived on scraps and uncertainty, consistency was a revelation. They were assigned work details, not as punishment but as policy. Prisoners capable of labor were expected to contribute, mending uniforms, peeling vegetables, cleaning barracks, sorting supplies. The work was tedious, never dangerous, and always supervised. Payment came in camp scrip, a currency that could be exchanged for cigarettes, toiletries, or extra rations at the camp canteen. It was a strange, almost surreal return to normalcy, commerce in a world that had burned down around them. Greta was assigned to the camp's administrative office, where her fluency in English made her useful. She filed forms, translated documents, answered questions for new arrivals who spoke no English at all. The British sergeant who had offered her tea ran the office with quiet efficiency, his desk stacked with clipboards and requisition forms and the endless paperwork of occupation. He never raised his voice. He never made threats. When Greta made a mistake, transposing numbers on a supply manifest, he simply handed the form back and said, "Again, please." She corrected it. He nodded. That was all. One afternoon, 2 weeks into her captivity, he asked her about Copenhagen. Not an interrogation, a conversation. What had she done there? Had she liked the city? Did she have family? She answered carefully, unsure if honesty was safe. He listened, asked follow-up questions, then told her about his own posting in Cairo before the war, about the heat and the noise and the strange beauty of a city that never slept. It was, she realized later, the first time in years that someone had spoken to her as if she were a person, not a category. Please subscribe to this channel and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The camp held more than 200 prisoners by the end of May, a mixed population of soldiers, auxiliaries, and civilian detainees awaiting classification. The demographics shifted daily. Men arrived from the front, were processed, and moved to larger camps in England. Women stayed longer, their status more ambiguous, their futures uncertain. Some would be repatriated to occupied Germany within months. Others would remain in British custody for years, working on farms or in reconstruction projects, their labor a form of reparations. Among the women, hierarchies emerged. A former Luftwaffe radio operator named Hannah, 41, sharp-featured, a veteran of the Eastern Front, appointed herself the group's unofficial leader. She negotiated with the British, mediated disputes, and enforced a code of conduct that emphasized dignity over despair. No stealing. No collaboration beyond what was required. No self-pity. "We are still soldiers," she told them one night in the barracks, her voice cutting through the darkness. "We will act like it." But the pretense was fragile. Late at night, when the lights were out and the guards had finished their rounds, the women whispered. They spoke of homes they could not return to, of cities that no longer existed, of families whose fates they did not know. One woman, a clerk named Anneliese, 19, who had joined the Wehrmacht to escape her stepfather, cried herself to sleep every night for a month. Another, a nurse named Katrin, stopped eating. Hannah and Greta sat with her for hours, coaxing spoonfuls of soup into her mouth, until finally she swallowed and nodded and whispered, "I'm sorry." They were prisoners. But they were also witnesses to their own unmaking. The war had given them uniforms, purpose, the illusion of importance. Defeat had stripped all of it away. What remained was the raw, uncomfortable question of who they had been beneath it all, and what they would become now. Greta's diary from that summer, preserved decades later in an archive of POW testimonies, captures the dissonance. June 12, 1945. Today I peeled potatoes for 4 hours. My hands smell like soil. The British corporal who supervised us told a joke in broken German, something about a chicken and a farmer, and Ilse laughed. I cannot remember the last time I heard her laugh. It frightened me, that sound. As if we had permission to be human again. June 19th. A letter arrived from the Red Cross. My mother is alive. She is in Bremen, living with my aunt. The city is rubble but she is alive. I cried so hard the sergeant asked if I needed the medic. I could not explain that they were not sad tears. July 3rd. Hannah argued with the commandant today about the work assignments. She thinks we should not be made to mend British uniforms. We are not servants, she said. The commandant listened, then said, you are prisoners. But you are right. We will rotate the assignments. I do not understand this place. I do not understand these men. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. By midsummer, the camp had settled into a rhythm that almost resembled peacetime. Prisoners worked their shifts, attended roll call, wrote letters home when paper was available. A small library opened in one of the barracks, donated books in German and English, mostly novels and technical manuals, but also poetry and philosophy. A handful of women formed a choir, rehearsing hymns and folk songs in the evenings, their voices echoing through the camp like a prayer. The British guards began to relax. Not carelessly, security remained tight, patrols constant, but the initial tension, the fear that violence might erupt at any moment, faded. Some guards learned German phrases. Some shared cigarettes during breaks. One, a Scottish corporal named MacLeod, who had fought in North Africa and Italy, taught Greta how to play chess. They played in the mess hall after dinner, a chessboard improvised from cardboard and painted stones. He won the first 10 games. She won the 11th. He grinned and said, you're learning. It was in these small moments that the propaganda began to crack. The women had been told for years that the British were bloodthirsty imperialists, that capture meant torture, that no mercy awaited the defeated. They had been told these things so often that belief had become reflex. But the reality, mundane, procedural, almost boring in its decency, undermined every certainty. The British were not saints. They were tired, bureaucratic, sometimes indifferent. But they were not monsters. And that gap between expectation and experience opened a space for something dangerous, doubt. Anneliese, the 19-year-old clerk, asked Greta one night, do you think we were lied to? About everything? Greta did not answer immediately. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the barracks, snoring, whispers, the creak of springs. Finally, she said, I think we were told what we needed to hear to keep fighting. Whether it was lies or truth doesn't matter anymore. The war is over. We lost. Now we have to decide what we believe. In August, the camp commandant, a lieutenant colonel named Harrington, 53, a career officer with a limp from the First War, organized a memorial service for the dead. Not just British dead. All the dead. He announced it at morning roll call, his voice formal but not unkind. On Saturday, there will be a service in the chapel. Attendance is voluntary. All faiths are welcome. The chapel was a prefabricated building at the camp center, painted white, its interior stark and unadorned except for a wooden cross and a British flag. When Saturday came, nearly every prisoner attended. They sat in rows, women on one side, British personnel on the other, and a chaplain, a mild-mannered Anglican priest with wire-rimmed glasses, read from the Book of Common Prayer. He spoke of loss and grief, of the futility of war, of the need to remember without hatred. Then he invited anyone who wished to speak. No one moved for a long moment. Then Hannah stood. She walked to the front, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. She did not look at the chaplain or the commandant. She looked at the rows of women, and she spoke in German, her voice steady and clear. We are here because we lost, she said. Not because we were wrong, not because we were right, but because we lost. That is the only truth that matters now. We mourn our dead. We do not apologize for mourning them. They were ours, and they are gone. She sat down. The chaplain nodded. He did not translate her words, but he did not need to. The silence that followed was its own translation. After the service, Harrington approached Hannah. He extended his hand. She hesitated, then shook it. Thank you, he said in careful German. She met his eyes. For what? He smiled faintly. For reminding me that grief is not the enemy. Christmas 1945 arrived with snow and a ration of Red Cross parcels that included chocolate, tinned ham, and real coffee. The commandant authorized a holiday meal, served in the mess hall on long tables covered with butcher paper. There was no turkey, no goose, but there was stew and bread and canned fruit, and for a few hours, the camp felt almost festive. The choir sang carols, Silent Night in German, O Come, All Ye Faithful in English, and some of the British guards joined in, their voices hesitant but sincere. Greta sat with Ilse and Anneliese, eating slowly, savoring each bite. She thought about the Christmas before, when she had been in Copenhagen, when the war had still seemed winnable, when the future had been an abstraction. She thought about the Christmas before that, and the one before that, each year bleeding into the next until time itself became a weapon. Now the war was over, and time moved forward again, and she did not know whether that was a gift or a curse. MacLeod stopped by their table, a mug of coffee in his hand. "Happy Christmas," he said. Greta nodded. "And to you." He lingered for a moment, then said, "You'll be going home soon. Heard the paperwork's nearly done." She looked up, startled. "Home?" He nodded. "Repatriation. January, maybe February. Back to Germany. Or wherever you want to go." She did not know how to respond. Home was a city she had not seen in 3 years, a place that might no longer exist. Home was her mother in Bremen, alive but living in the ruins. Home was a country occupied, divided, remaking itself in the image of its conquerors. She nodded again, slowly. "Thank you," she said. MacLeod tipped his head and walked away. That night, lying on her cot, Greta opened her diary and wrote. December 25, 1945. I am going home. I do not know what that means anymore. I do not know if I want to go. Here, I am safe. Here, I am fed. Here, I am not asked to explain what I did or why I did it. Home will ask those questions. Home will demand answers I do not have. But I will go, because that is what prisoners do. They go home. Even when home is no longer waiting. By early 1946, the camp's population had dwindled. Men were repatriated first, sent back to a Germany divided into occupation zones, their futures uncertain but at least theirs to navigate. Women followed in smaller waves, processed through Red Cross centers, issued travel documents, and released into a world that had moved on without them. Some went willingly. Some resisted, asking to stay, to work, to remain in the strange safety of captivity. Most requests were denied. The war was over. The camps were closing. The prisoners had to go. Greta left in February, along with 11 others. They were driven to Hamburg in a British convoy, processed at a displaced persons center, and given ration cards, a small sum of occupation currency, and directions to the nearest transit hub. The city was unrecognizable, block after block of rubble, streets cleared just wide enough for trucks, children playing in the ruins as if destruction were normal. Greta walked through it in a daze, her few possessions in a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, until she found a train heading south. Bremen was worse. The train station was a skeleton, its roof collapsed, its platforms crowded with refugees and soldiers and families searching for lost members. Greta found her mother's address, her aunt's address now, in a neighborhood that had been flattened and partially rebuilt with scrap wood and corrugated metal. She knocked on a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Her mother answered. She was thinner, grayer, older by a decade in the 3 years since Greta had seen her. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then her mother pulled her inside, held her so tightly that Greta could barely breathe, and whispered, "You're alive. Thank God, you're alive." In the years that followed, Greta rarely spoke of her time as a prisoner. She worked in a textile factory, married a school teacher, raised 2 children in a rebuilt Germany that was prosperous and democratic and bore no resemblance to the country she had grown up in. She kept her diary, hidden in a drawer, and on certain nights, usually in winter, usually when the snow fell and the world grew quiet, she would take it out and read her own words, written in the hand of a younger self who had learned that mercy was not weakness, that restraint was not surrender, that civilization survived not in the absence of war but in the small, deliberate acts of decency that followed. She thought often of the British sergeant who had asked when she last ate. She thought of the tea, the bread, the chess games with MacLeod, the Christmas carols sung in 2 languages. She thought of Hannah, who had refused to apologize for grief. She thought of Harrington, who had shaken her hand. These were not grand gestures. They were not moments that would appear in history books. But they were the moments that had saved her, that had reminded her she was human when everything else told her she was not. Decades later, in the 1980s, a historian researching POW experiences in post-war Europe contacted Greta. He had found her name in archived records, had tracked her down through church registries and municipal databases. He asked if she would be willing to share her story. She hesitated, then agreed. They met in a cafe in Bremen, a modern place with clean lines and bright lighting, worlds away from the corrugated barracks of Flensburg. She brought her diary. She read him passages. She answered his questions. At the end, he asked, "What do you want people to know? About what happened to you?" She thought for a long time. Then she said, "That mercy is a choice. Always a choice. The British soldiers who guarded us, they had every reason to hate us. We had bombed their cities, killed their brothers, brought war to their doorstep. But they chose restraint. Not because we deserved it, but because they believed it was right. That choice saved me. Not just my life, but my soul. I want people to know that. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent." Now, let's continue. The historian published his findings in a small academic journal. Greta's diary was donated to an archive specializing in women's wartime experiences. The story reached a few scholars, a handful of students, and then, like so many stories of that era, it faded into the background hum of history. But the lesson endured. In the wreckage of total war, when nations had burned and cities had fallen and the very idea of civilization seemed like a quaint relic, a handful of ordinary men had chosen to treat their enemies with dignity. Not because it was easy. Not because it was popular. But because they understood that who we are is defined not by how we fight, but by how we act when the fighting is done. Greta died in 2003, at the age of 81, in the same rebuilt city where she had arrived, broken and uncertain, nearly 60 years earlier. Her children found the diary among her effects, read it for the first time, and wept at the realization of how little they had known. Her granddaughter, a journalism student, wrote an article about it for a local newspaper. The article was picked up by a wire service, translated into English, and briefly circulated online before disappearing into the endless churn of digital content. But the words remained. Written in careful script on yellowed pages, they testified to a truth that generations would struggle to remember, that even in the darkest hours, decency was possible. That restraint was not cowardice but courage. That the question, "When did you last eat?" was not just an inquiry about food, but an acknowledgement of shared humanity across the unbridgeable divide of war. The convoy stopped where the road turned to gravel. The women sat in the back of British transport trucks, hands still bound, eyes hollow with fear. They braced for shouting. They heard pleas. And in that single word, offered by a weary sergeant in a dusty uniform, they found not forgiveness. They were not seeking forgiveness, but the possibility of survival. The possibility that the world had not entirely lost its mind. The possibility that mercy, however fragile, however contingent, still existed. They were soldiers. They were prisoners. They were human. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. The war had taught them fear, restraint taught them hope.